All right, welcome everyone to another edition of the SpectrumCast, the Data Resilience SpectrumCast. Over the course of the last 6 weeks, we took apart and we broke down the 6 key elements that are necessary to develop a data resilient environment. And we took it all the way end to end. We talked a little bit about what happens at the primary, all the way through the importance, especially the importance of your backup environment and how to architect for a nice resilient solution. So we started with the administration components of solutions. We talked about the ability to identify things in your environment. We talked about ensuring that you're taking advantage of encryption, multiple layers of recovery, air gapping, and automation and orchestration. And this week, what we wanted to try to do is kind of pack it all together and talk about adding Red Hat to this overall story. And because of that, we have Pete Brey. Pete, welcome to the SpectrumCast today.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
We've also have Randy, our co-host. And as always, our two subject matter experts, Sean and Tricia. Welcome, gang.
Thanks, Steve.
Great. So, Pete, you and I have had a couple of conversations, and I did share with you kind of that overall kind of thought process that we have around those 6 key things for building out a resilient environment. Talk to me a little bit about, one, introduce yourself, and then two, a little bit about how that overall message kind of fits with some of the things that Red Hat is thinking within this infrastructure.
Absolutely, Steve. And so just brief introduction here. I'm Pete Brey with Red Hat, the data foundation team at Red Hat, part of our OpenShift product that many of you are probably familiar with. So Steve, getting back to the topic here, obviously at Red Hat, we have a variety of different open source tools that we offer. One of them being OpenShift, which is really a Kubernetes platform that you can build on top of. And that's really the key point here is it's a platform that you can do a lot of different things with. If you want to build a cloud native future, OpenShift has a lot of various different tools that are built into it. One of these tools addresses the topic of security, which is what we're talking about here. It's called ACS, Advanced Cluster Security. And Red Hat acquired a company, I think it was maybe a year and a half ago, called StackRox. And if you think about OpenShift and you think about Kubernetes, you have all these microservices running around like little rabbits, right? They multiply, and you can quickly be managing hundreds, if not thousands, of these microservices. Well, think about the security concerns in that standpoint. You have all these different microservices, they're communicating with one another. How do you ensure you don't have like a man in the middle attack between a couple of your pods? And that's a key thing, and that's one of the key things that StackRox, now called ACS from Red Hat, addresses, is we ensure the container security running on OpenShift. So that's a key part. And again, back to what I was saying earlier about the platform aspect of this. We want to deliver a secure platform. But the message goes even further than that, Steve, because what's near and dear to our hearts here is, the data that goes along with those applications. And how do you ensure not just the applications are secure, how do you ensure the data is secure? And I think you hit the nail on the head here when you introduced the topics and you talked about encryption. I mean, there's some basic foundational things like encryption, and the state of affairs right now with encryption is it's become very advanced and it's become very difficult to crack, right? With 256-bit encryption, it's very, very difficult. But that's not enough in and of itself. You also have to have the ability to manage the keys that go along with that encryption. And for many of you who are maybe familiar with Kubernetes, these are called secrets in Kubernetes. And there's 2 ways you can handle this. You can handle it, your own way, storing it off in text files and things like that, which we all know is not very secure. And IBM has a key management offering, which enables enterprises to be able to manage these keys in a very secure way. And that's really, I think, the big theme here, Steve, as you talk about the 6 central topics, is having a holistic approach to security is very, very important. And that's one of the key things that we at Red Hat, we're trying to enable you to have a very secure platform that then you can build on top of.
So Pete, you talked a lot about the traditional security, the encryption, the different protecting against attacks. How do you see Red Hat when it comes to backup and that type of more traditional data protection and security?
Yeah, and that's really, speaking of like foundational building blocks, backup is like one of the key things, right? Particularly for these applications that are reliant upon the data and the availability of the data. Backup is the first line of defense, and we've introduced, and again, Red Hat, we're all about being open, and we published an open API called OADP, which stands for OpenShift Application for Data Protection. And it's an API that you can interact, your applications and even backup software can interact with the OpenShift platform in a standardized way. And this is really cool because, if you know anything about Kubernetes and what I was talking about earlier, there's a level of complexity because you're dealing with all of these microservices, like I said, running around like rabbits. And getting your arms around that, and more importantly, getting your arms around the namespace. And how do you do backup and how do you do restore in a consistent way in a Kubernetes context is very, very key. And it's different than a virtual machine environment and how you did backups in that environment. It's different than a bare metal environment, but it's not so different. And this is the Red Hat approach: is it doesn't matter whether you're bare metal, virtual, or running on Kubernetes. We want to give you a standardized approach. And that's the work that we've done together with the Spectrum Protect Plus team in terms of enabling Spectrum to Protect to deliver that consistent experience, irregardless of the underlying platform.
So Pete, if you take a look at the 6 things that we brought up before, right? The administrative security components, the ability to identify and monitor things going on in your environment. So we can even break from the storage thing for a second, right? What I want to get to is, if you think about these 6 things, encryption you covered, the recovery we kind of just talked about, air gapping, maybe not such a big thing within Red Hat itself, but maybe, and then the automation orchestration. Can you talk a little bit about, and you and I had a conversation about even taking that a step further, like what is this whole new aspect around zero trust encompass? Take us through some of these things and then kind of the thoughts on zero trust, because I think that's a good topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot to unpack there for sure. And I think that fits the theme here, is that security is not just a point thing that you have to think about. It's actually pervasive in almost everything you do as an enterprise. And so, we started the conversation here talking about some of the foundational elements. And what I wanted to add about the security is you got to think about not just as data at rest, but also as data is in flight, between applications, between the other topic we haven't touched on here is edge. And edge architectures are becoming more and more increasingly important for organizations. And, Steve, you talked about, and you mentioned zero trust. The concept here is that, say you're a manufacturer and you have a shop floor and you have all of these IoT devices, and maybe you've got, factories that are spread around the world. And, your goal is you want to be able to centralize the management of that and make sure that it's a secure architecture. Well, you've got all these IoT devices that represent, points of attack. And how do you ensure, and this is the concept of zero trust security, how do you ensure, that those devices are secure in and of themselves? And this kind of gets a popular term that's floating around the industry right now is, the digital supply chain or the software supply chain. And the concept is, how do you know that, these software modules in and of themselves are secure? That's one aspect of it. And then it's also a key concept here is it's a moving target, right? There's constantly new threats. I mean, we see this every day, right? And new exploits. And so it's not something you can just say, oh, we did the certification and it looks secure, we're done, and we can implement our architecture and we can rest. No, you have to stay on top of this constantly. And that's the concept of zero trust, is that, yes, you want to build, from known good devices, known good software, and have a good understanding that it's secure out of the box. but you also have, it's an ongoing process. The good news and the bad news here, I guess, is with respect to zero trust security.
So one of the things that I think we talk a lot about and we think about and we hear from clients is that as applications and infrastructures are moving more towards kind of microservices and containerization and all the things that the OpenShift ecosystem provides, it does increase levels of abstraction between physical data elements and how they're abstracted and presented to a user or to a downstream or upstream system as part of that digital supply chain you talked about a minute ago. So with that increased level of, to some extent, complexity, although the environment does a really good job of via orchestration and automation kind of abstracting away some of that complexity. But each of those handoffs, if you will, as you go from hop to hop and tier to tier and layer to layer and service to service, is another opportunity for another vulnerability potentially, or an opportunity. How does OpenShift, or how does the OpenShift ecosystem optimize that chain of custody from a security standpoint? Like what are some of the specific best practices and things that are architected into the solution to ensure the security and protection of each of those data elements throughout its life cycle?
Yeah, and those are excellent questions, and it's a rapidly developing space right now. I mentioned, the StackRox things that we're starting to put into OpenShift, which really at the application core level. But taking that conversation even further, Andy, things like how do you authenticate? Back to what I was talking about earlier, the IoT devices. What's the mechanism for how you handshake, those various different devices? Because if you've got, thousands of these devices out there, the very first thing you got to be able to do is establish a handshake, and perform some sort of authentication that this device is really a device that I want to connect to. And so that's some of the underlying infrastructure and the best practices, that we'll be talking about around our edge architectures that, we're going to be coming out and talking about here very, very soon. We have some announcements coming up about OpenShift single node, the ability to run, a very light footprint at the edge. And so, looking at it from the standpoint of if you have this edge core architecture, ensuring that the data is secure at the edge, at the ingestion points, but then being able to transport it in a secure way, if you want to, into your core data centers is really key. And it goes back to, a lot of the things that we talked about earlier, the encryption of both data at rest and data in flight. So, from that perspective, you've got to think about it holistically. OpenShift provides you a lot of tools in terms of solving this from a technical, standpoint. But there's, people, and we always talk about this in terms of three. There's the people, the process, and the technology. And you've got to have all three to be able to address this.
Now that prompts me to ask for your tech tip of the day on, as these people in the environment start moving into Red Hat, what would you recommend for them to start learning more about these topics that we're discussing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tricia. And we did a presentation a couple of months ago where we talked about this, and it was securing your data. And it goes back to a concept that's been around in the industry for a while called the CIA triad. CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so as you think about your data and your data assets, you need to be thinking about all three of these. The confidentiality, how do I ensure the right people have access to the right data at the right time? That's the confidentiality. The integrity, how do I ensure that the data is actually the real data and not some, fake data that's been hijacked or, affected by, some ransomware? So that's another key piece of it. And then the availability, which is a very large topic that we haven't really gotten into here, but we could talk, easily for another hour about data resilience. And Spectrum Protect Plus is a key part of what we're doing with OpenShift around the topic of data resilience. And it's a multi-layer approach. we start with snapshot technology to be able to give you point-in-time copies of data, but it goes further than that. We talked earlier, Steve, about data protection, and backup and restore is another line of defense that you can use. But it gets even more advanced when you start thinking about being able to build multi-site clusters and being able to replicate data across sites, across regions. And the reason you want to be able to do that is to deliver business continuity. And so we're working on those things. We've already got the snapshot technology and cloning technology built into OpenShift. We've been working very closely with the Spectrum Protect Plus team around the backup and recovery story, and it's an excellent story that we have out there to be able to do Kubernetes consistent backup and restore. And then very soon we're going to have the ability to do both synchronous and asynchronous replication across sites, so we can deliver that. And it comes back to you talk about tools. One of the things as an organization you need to be thinking about is what are the RTO and the RPO requirements that you're architecting against. And what we want to be able to do, both IBM and Red Hat, is deliver a range of solutions to meet your particular RTO and RPO requirements.
I guess my question is kind of, how does Red Hat, being an open source, essentially based product or set of products, how do you kind of reconcile two things, or reconcile, or do you have difficulties in that area?
Great question.
Oh, that's an awesome question. And it does. I mean, you mentioned the digital, supply chain, and this is a key concept. That how do I know that the code, the open source code that I'm deploying is, doesn't have, buggy code, doesn't have, malicious code in it. And we, part of what Red Hat does is we take, the code from the upstream open source projects, and we run it through a full battery of tests. That's one of the big values that we deliver as Red Hat is we can take the open source technology, which is great in and of itself because it's very flexible and very extensible. But we, harden it. We make sure that it's ready for enterprises to deploy. And this is one of the aspects, is ensuring that it's secure from the start. But we do that on an ongoing basis too. So remember what I said earlier about this zero trust concept, that you got to be thinking about today, but also in the future, how is it going to continue to be secure? And so that's a complete part of what we deliver when we deliver things like even Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but also OpenShift and our other platforms.
I'm glad you said that. I think a lot of our listeners, we focus this on the storage community, right? So I'm not sure. I think a lot of folks might think like Sean and say, "Oh, geez, well, Red Hat or that whole platform is an open source platform, which is great for development perspective, right? Because you can get a lot of the capabilities in there. But can I trust it, right? And that's a big thing, right? And if people are coming to the IT team saying, "Hey, I want to go do this," they have to start asking a lot of these questions, and I don't know what they know as an answer to that. And I'm glad you kind of helped us there.
And it's interesting. I think this problem is only going to continue. I don't want to say it's going to get worse because I think it's well understood. But let's face it, we're building hybrid clouds, right? And organizations have public cloud, they have on-prem, they probably have private clouds. And how do you, in addition to edge, so the level of complexity is going up here. And we didn't even really talk a lot about that. Like, how do you ensure, the public cloud is secure and the services that you're using there, as well as maybe the important point here is ensuring consistency in approach across all of those environments. It's a very difficult thing to do. And that's why you have to, ahead of time, really think about this as you're architecting, the solutions that you're going to deploy. You really need to think about the security aspects of this, both, from all three perspectives: the people, the process, and the technology that you're going to use.
Well, which I think is another area where automation can really be a benefit, because the policies and patterns that are developed to secure the environment, to ensure a clean, reliable deployment, to reduce the risk of any kind of vulnerability or, reduce the attack surface, to the extent that can be automated, those best practices can be automated and made more repeatable. that's only going to not only improve the reliability and the security of those environments, but also the time to value. So you don't, I presume you don't want the security implications to be a headwind against your, your agility and your speed of deployment. So.
Absolutely. And that's a thing we don't talk a lot about with automation. We talk about productivity gains with automation, but there's another huge benefit of automation, and that's deploying in a standardized way and eliminating the human error. And I think that's what you're touching on, Randy. And that's huge. I mean, if you've ever worked around these large environments with thousands of nodes, it's very difficult to ensure a consistent approach. Getting consistent operating system images onto all of those systems and making sure that they have security updates and all of that. It's very challenging, but automation is key to making that happen.
Yeah, and it also plays a huge role in response. So in the event or in the inevitable event that something does happen, there is some kind of an event or a cyber attack, that you're able to, in a, again, automated, repeatable way, recognize it, diagnose it, recover from it, without having to do it all manually and having to reinvent the wheel every time. So, again, whether it's ACM or, other aspects of the basic automation framework of Kubernetes in general, that's a huge point that I think people have to consider as they're architecting their environments and should consider.
Yeah.
So Pete, let me ask you one last question, and this is first of all, I think this has been great. I think it's helped us kind of understand, when you continue up the stack from storage all the way through into the infrastructure, things to consider. So what I wanted to ask you as a last kind of note for our listeners is, if you think about those 6 key things that I talked about: the security of the administration of the application, the ability to kind of discover things within your environment, the encryption, multi layers of backup, and I think you talked about the incorporation of what you do from a API level there, the air gapping, and then the automation orchestration we were just talking about. How do you feel Red Hat fits into those? I mean, pretty good. I mean, if I'm a listener and I'm thinking, I'm laying out these 6 key criteria to ensure that I have in my environment, do I feel good about plugging Red Hat into that, number one? And number two, am I missing anything that I should be thinking about? What's your thought there?
That's an excellent question, Steve. And it really, I think, gets to the heart. I mean, let's face it, Kubernetes is still rapidly evolving, right? Although I think we're starting to see, particularly, through the work that we're doing with IBM, we're starting to see major enterprises adopt the technology and like wholesale converting their applications to be cloud native. And that's part of the value that IBM and Red Hat add is, not only can we provide you the infrastructure for this, but we can help you, make that migration from, whether it's typical COBOL applications to, new cloud native applications that can take advantage of the benefits of Kubernetes. But the theme here, Steve, is, moving Kubernetes from the world where it was a toy, and you used it in your sandbox, to no, now this is like real world, serious enterprise infrastructure that you can build, very serious applications on. It doesn't matter the industry, if you're in financial services or healthcare or manufacturing, telcos. I mean, it's serious infrastructure that can be used for a wide variety of applications. And a lot of the things we talked about here are enabling that to happen. So to answer your question, that you started with, Steve, I think Red Hat is at the forefront of bringing enterprise functionality to Kubernetes and taking it from that it's a sandbox toy to no, this is something that you can really deploy on. And a lot of the things, that we work together, with the IBM teams on are delivering that enterprise functionality. And that really sets us apart in the marketplace.
Who had COBOL in the pool for this week?
I'll say I want to run my COBOL application on OpenShift. I mean, it kind of seems like opposite ends of the spectrum, doesn't it?
Hey, it's possible. Okay, don't knock it until you've tried it. It's possible.
I'm sure IBM is. I know. I bet you. Unfortunately,
that's the ultimate lift and shift.
Before we close out here, I want to lean on Randy for a second. He is our every week we take a spin on the wheel of misfortune, and we don't really have a. I mean, these cyber threats are so prevalent these days. We know there's stuff out there. The question, Randy, I have for you as our resident black hatter, right? What's your thoughts on all of this about adding the OpenShift capabilities, the Kubernetes capabilities, the container capabilities coming into this new type of need to be resilient?
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of touched on it earlier. I think the challenge it presents from a cyber resilience, in the broader sense, a cyber resilience perspective, is there are many more potential entry points into your environment now. So you're no longer just kind of, going back to the COBOL days. You don't just have a mainframe sitting in a back room with some 3270 terminals, hardwired into it. You've got this hybrid multi-cloud open architecture with a big portion of it, a big portion of the payload moving around on it is open source, and so there are a lot of new potential points of attack. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at before. I think that makes it more and more incumbent upon developers, architects, DevOps people, production people, everybody who's part of that digital supply chain to think about security and resilience and design for it up front. So it's not an afterthought. You can't wait until you're attacked and then figure out some kind of a mitigation strategy. You've got to design in security from the beginning at the foundational layer. And I think, as Pete has articulated here, I think the OpenShift ecosystem has done that in some sense for you. So it is built upon that highly secure, highly resilient, zero trust, hardened infrastructure from the ground up. So if I'm a developer or I'm an architect, I can now architect more confidently without having to necessarily be aware of every single chain of custody point within that infrastructure and what the potential vulnerabilities are. I need to still be cognizant of it, but I think I can spend more time focusing on functionality and less time focusing down at that level of the stack. If I'm a hacker, or I'm somebody who's out looking to do something malicious, I will be probing for those points. I'll be looking for those points of vulnerability and exploiting them. So, as always, the cat and mouse game, I think, will continue. It's just going to change the dynamic a little bit of how we think about architecting those solutions, and how, as I talked about earlier, and Pete mentioned, how we respond to them when they do occur. So, big answer to a short question, but.
No, but that's fantastic, because I always like how you wrap things up and kind of give your insights on that, and I think you said it way better than I definitely could. Pete, I want to thank you very much for participating, and the more I think about it, the more I think we need that extra level of vision into our podcast, and I'd love it if you come back on and talk more as we're going through this resilience kind of philosophy here.
Absolutely, that would be great.
Yeah, Pete's one of us.
All right, gang. Thank you all very, very much. And I appreciate it. And have a great day. And until next week, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.